The era of private space travel is upon us. Hi there, thanks for joining us for another Plain English lesson. I'm Jeff. JR is the producer, and you can find this full lesson, including the free transcripts, at plainenglish.com/273. In today's lesson, for the first time ever, an astronaut went to the International Space Station in a spacecraft built by a private company. It's the first time a private company put a human in space, but it won't be the last. The expression today is a dry spell. And of course, we have our video lesson, pronunciation exercises, and more at plainenglish.com/273. The United States is one of the world's leading space powers and was the first and only country to put a man on the moon. But for 9 years, we hadn't been able to launch our own astronauts into space. Embarrassingly, American astronauts had to hitch a ride on Russian or Chinese spacecraft if they wanted to access the International Space Station. That dry spell came to an end when Douglas Hurley and Robert Behnken made the 19-hour trip from Florida's Kennedy Space Center to the space station. What is remarkable about this is that Colonels Hurley and Behnken made the trip in a private vehicle, not a government one. They rode in a Dragon capsule, and that capsule was launched into space by a Falcon 9 rocket. Both the capsule and the rocket were made by SpaceX, a private company owned by Elon Musk. This is the first time anyone has made it into space while riding in a private company's vehicle. The age of private space travel is upon us. In the old days, America's space agency, NASA, would design a program and work with huge companies to build the design according to the government's exact specifications. Costs were exorbitant, and the design was inefficient. It's no wonder we didn't have a space shuttle for almost a decade. This time, NASA changed its approach. It didn't have the money to develop the new designs, so it decided to tell private companies what it wanted to achieve and then let the private companies compete to meet the objective at the lowest cost. Both SpaceX and a competitor, Orbital Sciences, have been taking cargo into space for the U.S. government for years. The recent mission to the space station was the first time a private company took a human into space. The costs to the U.S. government were far lower than previous manned missions. NASA has ambitions to return to the moon. The majority of the work on the next moon mission is being done the old way: government design, extremely expensive contracts, and a lot of political interference. But parts of the program are being contracted to private companies, including Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin. America is clearly getting more comfortable with the idea of private companies going deeper into space. So I know the next question on your mind: what about tourism? To date, only 7 private citizens have taken a trip to space, all aboard Russian government's Soyuz spacecraft. The cost was about $20 million per person. But now, SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, Boeing, and others are developing plans to take private tourists to space. Boeing is allowed to sell tickets to private citizens to ride along on its missions to the space station on behalf of the American government. SpaceX wants to take high-paying customers into orbit about 250 miles above Earth for costs in the millions of dollars. Blue Origin and Virgin are developing suborbital spacecraft, the kind that would just barely get you into outer space, let you feel weightlessness for a few minutes, and then return to Earth. Virgin Galactic is designing a spacecraft that would take 6 passengers at a time, about 50 miles above the Earth. To put that in perspective, the space station is about 250 miles above the Earth, so a Virgin flight would take you about 20% of the way to the space station. The costs would be a mere $200,000 or $300,000. If that's too much, there are smaller scale projects in the works too. Last week, a startup called Space Perspective announced plans to take tourists into space in a balloon. No, wait, keep listening. The spaceship Neptune is a 650-foot-long contraption that includes a huge balloon and a capsule. According to the design, the balloon will be filled with hydrogen and will carry a pilot and 8 passengers 19 miles above Earth, where they'll spend a few hours looking down on the planet. The balloon will then slowly come down and splash into the ocean. In the transcript, I put space in quotes. Even as I pronounce it, I'm doing air quotes with my fingers, because although 19 miles straight up is a long way, it's still not what scientists generally consider to be space. To get to space officially, you have to go 50 miles up. Still, 19 miles in a balloon is about 2.5 times higher than a typical airplane flies. Space Perspective has leased the former Space Shuttle landing pad at the Kennedy Space Center and will begin testing its balloon next year. This was a high-tech lesson, and I wanted to let you know that JR and I are going to host a high-tech webinar soon, and the topic is going to be the best technology tools for learning English in 2020. A lot of you ask, what kinds of tools can I use to improve my English? What websites are there? Where should I go to practice? So, I did some research on the best online tools for learning English, and I gathered all my notes and put them all into a web class, which I will be hosting later this month. I'll do a few of them so you can find a time that's convenient to you. If you're curious, if you want to join, you can find a link right on the homepage of plainenglish.com. You can also see it on your dashboard if you're a free member or in the transcript of this lesson. The best technology tools for learning English in 2020, and it's free, so check it out. Today's expression is a dry spell. This is funny. It's one of those terms that we use frequently. But then when I look at it, when I look at the words, I think this makes no sense. What is a dry spell? A dry spell is a time when you're not doing something that you want to be doing. The phrase originated to describe a drought, a long period with no rain. That's where we get dry from. You want it to rain, at least sometimes, in order to grow crops, or maybe today to grow grass or grow your vegetables in the garden. You need some rain. If you go a long time without rain, you're in a dry spell. Your grass is brown. Your tomato plants are not producing red, ripe tomatoes. Everything's dry. You're in a dry spell. We were in a little bit of a dry spell here in Chicago as summer started. But yesterday, we had some pretty strong storms in the afternoon. The dry spell was welcome because our restaurants are open for outdoor dining only. So if you want to sit outside and have a meal, you don't want it to be raining. The dry spell was good for restaurant owners, but the dry spell snapped. The dry spell came to an end yesterday afternoon with some heavy storms. We often use this when there's any extended period without productivity or without activity. You heard earlier today that the U.S. space program was in quite a dry spell. Yes, we sent astronauts to work on the International Space Station, but ever since our Space Shuttle program was retired in 2011, American astronauts have had to ride on Russian spacecraft to reach the space station. The U.S. had not launched an astronaut into space for 9 years, at least not on its own vehicle. That is a long, dry spell for a country that is one of the world's 2 leading space powers. Companies can have a dry spell. Some say that Apple had a dry spell after Steve Jobs died. Yes, they introduced the Apple Watch, but the watch was never a big hit like the iPad, iPhone, and iPod that came before. But even though they haven't introduced any revolutionary products, I do think the iPhone X, when it was released, broke the dry spell in new products. That was, by the way, the topic of the very first plain English lesson way back in December 2017. A drug company might have a dry spell. Drug companies try to maintain a good pipeline of new drugs, but you never know what drugs will eventually work out and which will never get approved. A drug company might suffer a few years without any newly approved drugs, and that would be a dry spell. A person's career can have a dry spell. We would usually say this for a creative professional, a painter, an actor, a movie maker, a musician. This happens in the creative professions. You either don't get inspiration or what you produce is just not as popular as you thought it would be. Whatever the reason, creatives can suffer from a dry spell. Pablo Picasso suffered a dry spell in the early 1930s. Beethoven suffered a dry spell between about 1815 and 1820. He was in his 40s and was battling his own deafness, and he had a custody battle for his nephew at the time. He didn't produce very much for those 5 years. He was in a dry spell. He was productive before, he was productive after, but during those 5 years, he wasn't as productive. He was in a dry spell. That doesn't mean he didn't produce anything at all. It just means it wasn't as significant. Time for the song of the week. It is Ahead by a Century by the Canadian band The Tragically Hip. It was really popular in Canada when it was released in 1996. The song was nominated by Camila, a Plain English Plus member in our forums. We were talking about what shows we had watched in the quarantine. Camila said she was watching Anne with an E and suggested we highlight this song because this is what plays during the opening credits. The lead singer of The Tragically Hip was Gord Downie, one of Canada's most influential musicians. He led that band from 1984 until he died of brain cancer in 2017. Ahead by a Century by The Tragically Hip is JR's Song of the Week. Yes, it was nominated by Camila, but JR always has the final say, and he gave his seal of approval to this song this week. That's it for today. Any takers for the space balloon? I've always wanted to go in a hot air balloon. I don't know if I do the space balloon. I think I'll let others try that one first. Remember also our webinar coming up later this month, The Best Technology Tools for Learning English in 2020. We'll have several times available to accommodate our friends in all the different time zones around the world. So that's on the homepage at plainenglish.com or on your dashboard if you're a member. That's all for now. Thanks for being a huge part of Plain English. Keep up the good work, and remember to join us right back here every Monday and Thursday.